We are somehow halfway through 2024, which means we need to take a look back over the first half of this year and talk about the best books that have been published so far. This is my top 10 books of 2024 so far, and as always, everything I'm talking about here is fiction, and everything on this list was published in English this year. If they're works in translation, they were likely published earlier than this year, but each of the 10 books that I talk about here was freshly published in English this year. I never ever understand the appeal of just running down the 10 best books you've read so far this year. You could have read those at any time. These are new books, and they're all amazing, so let's not waste any more time, except to say that this list is in no particular order. All 10 of these books are fantastic. I hate the stringy bits. Absolutely hate the little stringy bits. If you ever find one in your mouth, oh, it's horrible. Oh, God. Look at me. Published back in February was the science fiction short story collection from Korean author Bora Chung, Your Utopia, translated into English by Anton He. This was Bora Chung's follow-up collection after the enormous success of Cursed Bunny. Cursed Bunny was quite a broad selection of stories. It has a fairy tale feel to it, although the stories in here really broach an enormous range of genres. There's a lot of horror, there's a science fiction story, a straight up fantasy story, and as I said, a lot of these tales have a kind of fairy tale feel to them. But Your Utopia, as I said, is a straight up science fiction collection. But just as Cursed Bunny broaches a bunch of different genres, Your Utopia explores all the different corners of science fiction. There are stories in here of every kind when it comes to sci-fi. When you think about different sci-fi concepts, you might think of spacefaring adventures, time travel, artificial intelligence, something post-apocalyptic, machine warfare, cloning, eerie dystopias, and other things besides. Sci-fi explores a lot of different avenues, and pretty much all of those avenues are wandered down by Bora Chung in Your Utopia. Science fiction fans couldn't really ask for anything more than this, because every kind of sci-fi is explored here. One story that stuck with me in particular was the tale of a car, an intelligent car, that drives itself. The apocalypse has happened and this car is driving around in a kind of Jean-Paul Sartre inspired search for meaning. It meets an android who gets into the back seat, and there's even a boss battle in this story. There are crazy tales in here. If I'm being honest, I don't think this reaches the heights of Cursed Bunny, but that's because I really liked the breadth of that collection and the fact that it leaned more into horror and creepiness. As fans of this channel know, I love horror, but I do also love science fiction, and that's why this book is on this list. It is absolutely one of the best things published this year so far. Honford Star only publish knockout books, and this is absolutely one of them. Then we have Lost in the Garden by Adam S. Leslie. I'm not a fan of long books. I really like my books to be nice and short. Lost in the Garden is a pretty thick guy. It is 450 pages long, and I loved every single word, every moment I spent in this strange, strange world. This is a book I enormously related to because it's about the creepiness of rural England. The book is hilarious, but it's also arguably a horror story. It's not terrifying, I suppose it's more of an existential dread, but it's also a charming and hilarious road trip. Lost in the Garden tells the story of 3 girls. These girls are living through a kind of apocalypse. Over the past few years, people have begun reanimating. They are not zombies, and they're not ghosts either, because they are corporeal. But like zombies, they are relatively brainless and violent. Rather than eating people, if they get too close, they'll just bash your brains out. But life has kind of gone on in its own way, not quite in a private rights way, which we'll come to in a moment. And these 3 girls have decided to take a road trip to a place called Almonby. In this world, young English children are told, you don't go to Almonby. It is a forbidden village. Nobody should ever go there. But you don't know why. And the boyfriend of one of our 3 girls has gone to Almonby, promising that he will return. And when he doesn't, she decides to go after him. One of her friends has to take a package to Almonby, And the third, well, she's tagging along because she has a crush on the first. And so they hop in a car and off they go to the village of Almonby. That's all I'm going to tell you. I made a pretty beefy analysis review video of this book a little while back, so go check that out. It's been a really interesting conversation since this book came out because people in my comments, people in my Patreon Discord, they've all had different things to say about their interpretation of this novel. It is very much something that encourages interpretation, and each person is going to have a different way of interacting, engaging, and connecting with this novel, its themes, its setting, its characters, its ideas. It's ambitious, but it's not intimidating or frightening in that way. As someone who grew up in a small village in England, I related to the creepiness, the almost sanitary weirdness of rural English life. Please read it if you haven't and let me know what you take away from this almost enigmatic novel. This is Not a River by Selva Almada. It was translated from Spanish into English by Annie McDermott, and if you've spent any time on this channel, you probably know how much of a fan I am of Selva Almada. In fact, a few weeks ago, I was in Edinburgh at Topping & Co, where I interviewed Selva Almada in front of a sold-out audience, and it was one of the best experiences of my entire life. This book was shortlisted for the Booker International Prize 2024, and so Selva Almada did a little tour of the UK with Charco Press, and I am so grateful that I got to interview her. She is one of the great Argentinian authors, one of the great feminist authors, and meeting and talking to her was a real pleasure. I cannot stress that enough. As for Not a River, this is a tiny little 100-page novella. It is the third in a thematic trilogy, which began with The Wind That Lays Waste, followed by Brickmakers. I've talked to a lot of people who are fans of her, and we each have our favourites of this trilogy. And I have to say, this is not my favourite. My favourite of that trilogy is my favourite Almada book and my favourite Argentinian novel ever, The Wind That Lays Waste. But Almada is a genius feminist author, and all three of these books are immaculate things. As I talked about in the interview, Not a River is the most curious and complex of the three, and arguably the most subtle. It's a tiny little thing about a group of men who have made a tradition of going out into rural Argentina. They sit on a river, they go fishing, they hunt, and this is about their relationships with each other, their relationship to a friend who's no longer with them, and they've replaced him with his son on this particular trip, and also their relationship to the landscape, to the river, and to the people who live nearby. To me, this is a novel about arrogance, about the ownership that men take over the things around them, be they people or animals or even the landscape around us. It's a novel about how men often behave as though they are owed certain things. They are entitled to things. Entitlement is, for me, the focal point of this novel. But as I said, it is kind of a vague thing. There is a nebulous ambiguity to this novel, which means I think it's very much up for interpretation, like Lost in the Garden. But Selva Almada is one of the great Argentinian authors, and this book, like all of her others, perfectly demonstrates how and why. While I was on the train back and forth between Glasgow and Edinburgh to do the interview with Selva Almada, I was reading this. Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. I've read a few Tremblay books and I've really enjoyed all of them, but this is the first one to really get under my skin. This thing is like nails driven into you. It is oppressive, it is skin crawling, it is very eerie and honestly frightening in its own peculiar, unique way. It's a novel of two halves, each being told in an intertwined way. One is the narrative of this guy who, in the early 90s, made an independent horror movie with his friends, all of whom are now dead. That film never saw the light of day. Now he's in his 50s, and he's been invited to Hollywood to talk to studios about doing a remake of this film and being a consultant on that remake. The other half of the book is the manuscript to that original independent film. So gradually, as we read the novel, we read the movie. We find out what the movie was about and how eventually it all ends. And through the main narrative, we find out what happened to the people who made it and why they all died one by one. This is a very exhausting, very psychologically oppressive thing. It weighs heavy on your mind. It becomes more and more twisted and unhinged as it goes on, but at no point does it actually fall away from itself or lose itself in its own strangeness. It holds you very, very tight, and it hurts. This is a really powerful piece of horror fiction. I will never, ever forget my time reading this book. It is and I am utterly amazed. If you're a horror fan, do not miss this. And if you've read Tremblay and you've thought, yeah, he's good, I like him well enough, this will blow your socks off. Although I haven't ordered this list, I do think that this next book is probably top 3. A Woman of Pleasure by Kyoko Murata. Translated from the Japanese into English by Juliet Winters Carpenter, I am very confident that this book will end up on my best of year list come December. A Woman of Pleasure is a piece of Japanese historical fiction. It is set at the turn of the 20th century, and we follow a young girl who is sold by her parents to be a courtesan. She comes from a small, nowhere fishing village. She has a thick dialect that makes everyone around her hard to understand. She's bad at communicating, and she is now working as a courtesan in a big city. And this book kind of lacks plot, very much on purpose and to its credit. It is a diary of her life. It is her experiences, and most of all, it's about her relationship to the other courtesans. She gets to know these women. She becomes good friends with them. She's raised by them. She is taught by them. And she also has an almost infectious optimism. While this is a book about indentured servitude, about women whose bodies are being sold and not by them. And while this book features men who take advantage of these women, both financially and physically, and all of the scars and all of the horror that comes with it, it's still a positive novel because of our protagonist. She is hopeful. She is curious. She develops skills and knowledge. She learns to read and write. She writes poetry. She constantly looks for the benefits of her life and thinks about all of the things that have happened to her that are good things, the relationships that she's formed, and the art that she's now creating. But the novel also builds towards emancipation, not just for these sex workers, but for working people in Japan in general. Because at this time in Japan, more than 100 years ago, there was a huge wave of strikes and unionization across the country, and these women will eventually get wrapped up in that. This is a wonderful, exceptional Japanese novel. Easily one of the best books that I've read this year so far is Private Rites by Julia Armfield. A desperately oppressive novel. Definitely not for everyone, not for the faint of heart. This book will exhaust you. Fair warning, but if you can stomach that, it is absolutely worth it. This is at once an apocalypse novel and a King Lear-inspired family drama. Our protagonists are 3 sisters whose father has just died, and that father was an architect in a world that is drowning. This is a book that's taking place during the apocalypse, presumably just a few years from now. As sea levels rise and rainfall gets worse, Britain has drowned. But people continue to live and work. Capitalism keeps going. The cogs of the machine keep turning. People commute to work on raised train lines. You can no longer drive anywhere, and there's no longer any international travel, but people are still able to go to coffee shops, and they still go to work every day. One of our protagonists is a therapist. People are still going to therapy. Everything's too expensive and people can barely survive. But capitalism won't let go. And while the world is horrific, feels very real in an itchy, uncomfortable kind of way, we are following 3 protagonists, as I said. These sisters are reconnected by the death of their father, but they do not get along. Especially the 2 older sisters who've never liked their younger half-sister. And we, as the reader, jump between perspectives, from sister to sister, as the book goes on. We learn more about them and about their relationships, but we also get this niggling feeling all the way through that we don't know them. We don't know these people at all. No matter how much time we spend with them, we never truly get into their minds. It's an amazing thing that Julia Armfield manages to pull off, honestly. And it makes us beg the question, how do you ever really get to know anyone? Meanwhile, the world is drowning all around them. This is the kind of book that you will never ever forget. Once you read it, you will feel changed, for better or worse. This is the new Seoul Park Jelly Massacre, the second book on this list published by Honford Star. It was written by Korean author Cho Yi-eun and translated into English by Ye-won Jung. It was originally a short story and eventually expanded into a full novel, and it's a very strange thing. Most of the novel takes place at a theme park, and from chapter to chapter, we jump from perspective to perspective, almost like a short story collection contained in one place. And across one single day as well. And weird things are happening to these people on this day. One by one, our characters meet a man who is selling a jelly candy. And he promises people that if you eat this and you give it to someone you love, a boyfriend, a parent, a sibling, whatever, the 2 of you will be bonded forever. Aww. But he means it literally, because you eat the candy, they eat the candy, and you start dissolving into goo, and the goo all merges together like that. And we follow different characters during this day, and I don't really want to say any more. This is a wild book, a very strange and brilliant thing. I have plenty more thoughts about it if you go watch my original video review, which I did not too long ago. If you love weirdness, this is weird. There's even a demonic cult at one point, somehow. Alien Clay is a new sci-fi novel from one of the great minds of the genre, Adrian Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky seems to have a boundless imagination. And not only that, but as his books go on, he becomes more and more openly political, or at least more obviously political in his writing. And Alien Clay is set in the distant future, where the world is controlled by a tyrannical government, and our protagonist is a scientist who spoke out against this government and has been punished. He is sent to a planet called Kiln. And this planet is a curious place because littered across its landscape are the remnants of a civilization that no longer seems to exist. Buildings, huts, strange artwork and carvings. There was an entire civilization here that no longer exists, and our protagonist, along with many other prisoners and scientists and guards and people with other responsibilities, they've been sent to investigate and to understand, because the tyrannical government of Earth believes that there is something in the behavior, the evolution, the ecology, the society, the history, something in Kiln that will help justify and support and explain the righteousness of tyrannical governments. It's a fascinating concept. And we follow our protagonist as he is forced into dangerous manual labor to explore and investigate this planet. And what he finds there is utterly fascinating. I'm going to use a word that I used in my review here. Lego. The evolutionary structure of this planet, of the things that live on this planet, is like Lego. I'll leave it there. One of my absolute favorite reads of this year is Aftershock by Chinese author Zhang Ling. This book does not get enough attention. I haven't seen anyone else talk about it, anyone else review it, and I am absolutely positively in love with this novel. Please check this out. Zhang Ling is a Chinese author who lives in Canada, and the book begins in Canada with a Chinese woman who has been living in Toronto for quite a while. She and her husband, who is also Chinese, have a kid. Their relationship is on the rocks. She's depressed, and we begin in a therapist's office. And then we flash back to her childhood. Actually, no, we flash back even further to her mother's childhood. In the midst of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution, we follow her mother as she grows up, gets a job, gets married, has a family, and then we're introduced to her daughter, our original protagonist. They have a decent and happy family home life until an enormous earthquake literally shatters and fractures their family into pieces. And this earthquake really happened in 1976 in the city of Tangshan, not too far from Beijing. And we continue to follow her and her family in the aftershock of this earthquake. I was utterly captivated by this book. It is a beautiful family drama. It is an incredible story of a woman's life and the things she sees, the things she goes through, the people she meets, her resilience, the man she eventually marries, the work she eventually does, her move to Canada. There is so much in here, so much beauty. I could talk about this book for hours. Please check out Aftershock. It is not getting enough love and attention, and I think it's my favorite book of this year so far. A wonderful work of Chinese fiction. Translated, by the way, by Shelley Bryant. I almost forgot to mention that. Shelley Bryant's translation is masterful. Okay, did I just say that Aftershock was my favorite book of this year so far? Because I now can't remember. And that might have been a lie. And the reason it might have been a lie is because my favourite book of this year so far is A Botanical Daughter by Noah Medlock. This thing slaps. This is a queer, gothic, historical, horror novel. Any one of those four things would be enough to make me pick up a book, and this is all of them. A Botanical Daughter is set at the tail end of the Victorian period. Our protagonists are Simon, a taxidermist, and Gregor, a botanist. They live together in a botanical garden outside of London. Simon does his taxidermies in the basement, and Gregor explores botany in the main garden. But one day, Gregor gets his hands on a strange plant that has been shipped to him all the way from Indonesia. This is a squirming and writhing, living mycelium. It is intelligent. It has the power to manipulate other living things. And Gregor thinks that he can use it to create a unique kind of life. But in order to do so, he's going to need help from his partner, the expert taxidermist Simon. To say much more would be to spoil it, but I do have a full review that goes into more details, still avoiding spoilers. A Botanical Daughter is an intensely Frankenstein-inspired novel, so I was always going to like it at the very least. Frankenstein is my favourite novel, I say that a lot. But this is also a wonderfully queer novel, exploring how a gay couple, who very hilariously don't often seem to actually get along, can live in a Victorian society. They are two unusual people as it is, and they make their relationship work as best they can. This is a very funny book. Their relationship is often hilarious. And just like Frankenstein, it's a book that explores morality, the power of scientific exploration for good and bad, and it is a creepy gothic thing. I love this book more than I can say, and it might well end up being my favourite book of this year. We're only halfway through, so I won't get too excited, but I want to thrust this book into the hands of everyone I meet. Everyone who appreciates good horror, gothic fiction, queer fiction. You'll have a blast with this book. It is funny, it is bleak, it is everything I love in a work of fiction. A Botanical Daughter really is perfect. There you go, those are my top 10 books of this year so far. I'm going to be very curious, obviously, to see which books of these end up on my best of year list come December. Let me know your favourite books of this year so far in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/WillowTalksBooks. And as always, subscribe for books.